So I run Dufferin Veterinary Services out of Orangeville, Ontario. We're a full-service large animal practice. There's 3 vets, myself, Dr. Rudy Walkley, and Dr. Mandy Mulder. And we do horses is about half of our practice. A lot of repro and pleasure horses, not a lot of racing, not a lot of super real high performance horses, but some. So I work with Deb pretty closely on both equine and bovine repro. So I came this evening rushing from her place, breeding a couple of mares with frozen semen. And when we get done here, we get to go back and check Pony again because she still didn't ovulate. And
oops, that wasn't me.
It's not your fault.
It's not my fault.
It's the pony's fault. So we're going to talk. Deb asked me if I'd come and talk a little bit about parasite control in horses. So there are some worms hanging out in that poop. It's not nearly as nice as Alex's poop earlier. There's me. So plan for tonight, we're going to try and talk about what kind of worms might be in there, when to deworm our horses, who to deworm, and try and figure out what we should be deworming with. So small strongyles are the first thing that we're going to talk about a little bit. They are also known as cyathostomes. These are probably the most important worm that we deal with in horses now in the 2000s. In the 1970s and early 1980s, we didn't think this was actually very important at all. It was something that we found there, but wasn't something that we thought was all that exciting until we started using a lot of wormer. So the one main point about small strongyles that makes them a little bit special is that they can do what's called encyst in the wall of the intestine. So they actually crawl into the wall of the intestine and they hibernate there is essentially what they do. So they just hang out. And while they're there, they don't do a lot of damage or cause a lot of problems. They do cause a bit of irritation to the wall. So that's sort of those little red dots are encysted larvae in there hiding in the gut. So while they're there, they don't cause a lot of problems. But if they all wake up at once from being encysted and come out, they can cause some definite issues there. And that encysting process can cause an issue when it comes to treatment and whether or not we're going to kill those ones that are hidden and hibernating. Small strongyles we care about essentially because they can cause diarrhea in really large numbers, and they can cause ill thrift as well in both young and adult horses. When we think of small strongyles, we think mostly of adult horses and not in our young stock. Large strongyles are what we were excited about before our regular tubes of wormer became common, our paste wormers. Strongylus vulgaris is the most common one of those worms. As I said, historically the most important worms in horses. Now we see infections with Strongylus vulgaris very rarely. I have had one case in my 11 years, which was in a group of ponies that had never been dewormed. They were in a very small pasture situation. They were kind of living on top of one another, many babies born. General nutrition wasn't great, and he actually lost some horses to the migration through the mesenteric artery. So the mesenteric artery is one of the big blood vessels that supplies the whole gut from the heart. And so when the worms are in the gut, they actually crawl through the wall of the gut, float around in those arteries as part of their process of maturing. They have to leave the gut to mature in the horse, and then they come back into the gut and shed eggs in the manure. So these blood vessels can get really damaged, and they can actually blow up. So they can either get full, get a thrombosis, so that's a blood clot essentially, or they can rupture and the horse can bleed to death due to that rupture. So prior to having wormers at all, this happened somewhat regularly often in young adult horses. But now that we deworm really regularly, just about everywhere, we see this very rarely. In wild horse populations where there is no wormer, these make up maybe something like 10% of the eggs that are shed, but they're a far more important worm than the small strongyles. Parascaris quorum are roundworms. Roundworms are particularly important in young horses, in foals and weanlings. They can actually cause respiratory signs as they're migrating through the body, in primarily the trachea. And so sometimes if we see young horses coughing and acting a bit strange in the summertime, but they don't have any fevers, they don't really have a snotty nose, they just have a funny cough, we should put roundworms on our list of things to think about. We can see definitely ill thrift in foals and yearlings that have high roundworm burdens. So this is our classic skinny, pot-bellied, ugly-looking 6-month-old foal that just, we wonder what's wrong with it. You know, if its nutrition has been good and it's just not thriving, we should definitely be putting roundworms on our list of things to think about. If we get high numbers of roundworms, we can see impactions because they can build up in the gut as a little pile of worms and actually stop the fecal material from passing very well. And if we get a lot of roundworms in the gut and we kill them with certain wormers, we can actually make this worse, because if we kill them all at once, then they end up as a dead pile in there, and it's almost like a little ball of baler twine in the gut that can cause problems. So if we're purchasing particularly horses that are probably close to a year old that have absolutely unknown history, so more likely to be rescuing those sorts of horses, or maybe if we're going to a weanling sale that has horses come from all over, maybe Western Canada, maybe who knows where, we want to be cognizant of the fact that if they've never had dewormer, we probably shouldn't go and throw something that kills those worms really quickly into them. So that would be our ivermectins and moxidectin. We wouldn't want to necessarily hit those foals with that. Tapeworms, this big, long, fancy name. Some studies have shown an increased risk of colic related to tapeworm infection. This study came out probably in the somewhere 2003, 2005, somewhere in that neighborhood, kind of just before our drug companies started to offer us things that made deworming for tapeworms a lot easier. So the drug companies kind of jumped on that one major study. It's actually a really poorly done study. It basically asks the question, do horses that have colic and end up in postmortem rooms in universities have tapeworms? And the answer for a bunch of them was yes. They also had 2 ears, they had a tail, they probably had hay in their gut, they might have grain in their gut. So it didn't do a great job of asking, did the horses that died of colic and came to our postmortem room have tapeworms more often than horses that came to our postmortem room because they broke their legs or they had respiratory disease or any of those other things? So the true cause and effect of tapeworms and colics is, to me, a little bit suspect, but it's out there and it's widely cited in the research. So tapeworms are not going to be picked up on the regular fecal that we're going to talk about later, and they're not killed by the regular worming that we would do when we're looking at our roundworms or our strong giles. So something to keep in mind. Those are tapeworms hanging out on top of that poop. They may have ended up there in that many numbers because that horse had a tapeworm killer given to it in the last 3 or 4 days. And so often they come rushing out. So one way to decide whether or not you really, really need to use a tapeworm killing product is, if you don't see any tapeworms after you've used it, we're gonna assume that the wormer worked, which is a bit of a leap, but so far we don't know that there's any resistance to the tapeworm drugs. So if you don't see any tapeworms after you use some of those drugs, you probably didn't have a very big tapeworm burden at all. When to deworm? So it really comes back to a question of when is my horse going to get worms, and when might we need to deal with them. So strong giles are spread on pasture when the temperature is between 6 and 33 degrees Celsius. Summer. Once we get below 6 degrees, once we get under about 10 degrees, the growth of worms on pasture, so they need to go from egg into an infective larval stage on pasture, be living on a blade of grass, and get eaten by a horse. Once we get below 10 degrees, that happens very poorly. And once we get actually above about 30 degrees, it starts to be poor as well. So if you live in Arizona where it's really hot and really dry, worms are actually have less of a problem than if you live somewhere where we have warmth and heat at the same time. Georgia is a worm's favorite place to live because it's humid, it's wet, and it's hot for a big chunk of the year. Worms don't do so well when there's frost. They don't do well at all when there's frost. Some will survive over the winter as eggs. The larval stages will die, but some eggs will overwinter on pasture. Small strongyles will start to insist in the fall, in usually late September or October. They will start that hibernation process. So they will hide out there. Our other strongyles, our large strongyles, will not insist, but they won't necessarily shed a lot of eggs through the winter. So that comes back to our question of fecals later. But when we're looking at all strongyles, we don't need to worry particularly in the winter. When there's frost happening regularly, we're not picking up any new eggs, even if we're living in pasture. If we come into dry lots that have no grass at all in them, then we have no worries at all. If for some reason we're a horse that lives in a sand ring and never, ever, ever touches grass, strongyles are essentially of no importance to us. If we're a race horse that lives in a stall and goes to the track for exercise and it comes back and it stays in a stall, maybe it gets walked for a bit to be cooled out, but it doesn't grass, worms are not a problem. Or strongyles are not a problem at the very least. So back to the when to deworm idea. Late fall is a good time to kill worms that are picked up through summer grazing. So that's going to be our mainstay of deworming is to make sure that we either decide whether or not we need to treat, or we may make a decision as a group that we're going to treat everybody on our farm in a late fall situation. Essentially, once we get to those days of 6 degrees, once we get a good killing frost, our picking up new eggs is going to basically go to zero. If some strongyles are insisted by that time, they may not be killed depending on what wormer we use. There is no reason to deworm a horse in the middle of winter if we have dewormed it late in the fall. If we have forgotten all about deworming and it's February and we know we haven't dewormed for a year and a little bit, we usually deworm in November and we forgot, then we might decide to deworm in winter. Although if our burdens aren't high, we're probably not going to get very much killed. And our fecal egg counts midwinter are going to be not as accurate for us as well because of that insisting idea. They're not shedding eggs because they're just going to get killed if they're out there. So the worms are kind of smart. Spring worming in May and June may kill some of those emerging insisted larvae, and overwintered worms picked up on grass. So if we go out to grass for a month or so, we're probably going to hammer both sets of those worms pretty well with just about any of our wormers if we need to. Roundworms and foals are picked up both on and off pasture, and infection starts near birth generally. So roundworm eggs live in stalls. They don't require that grass step to complete the life cycle. So we need to consider roundworms even in foals that are born in February and are basically living inside. Roundworms happen maybe actually more frequently in those horses than they do in foals that are living on big pastures spread out further. So recommendations for roundworms are to deworm starting around 3 months old and repeating every 3 months for the first year. Yearling deworming is important to consider for roundworms, and that's going to depend a little bit on our environment, how many young horses are put together, and a number of other things. If we only have one yearling, its roundworm burden is going to be probably much less than if we have a whole group that are reinfecting one another. Who to deworm? So foals we just covered. Because we're mostly concerned about roundworms in them, we want to regularly deworm those horses. Horses under 3 years old are likely to need more frequent deworming than older horses when we look at small strongyles. And really the question that we would like to know the answer to most of the time is, what is the horse's fecal egg count? So that's going to be the best way to determine if deworming is required for each individual horse. And that really is generally only answering the question, what is our small strongyle burden like? When you look at them, is it on the next slide? Yes, it is. When you look at them under the microscope, these are strongyle eggs, and those are roundworm eggs. Very different looking. You can't tell what kind of strongyle it is based on the egg. So when we look at those under the microscope, I can't tell you whether they're small or large strongyles, but I will bet you that 95% of them are small strongyles in basically all of our horses in North America. Hopefully, if we're paying attention when we're doing those fecals, we will say, hey, there's some roundworms here, and count them separately than the strongyles. So we use what's called the modified McMaster procedure for the fecal egg count. The one I use identifies more than 50 eggs per gram. So what we do is we count eggs on a slide, and due to the dilution, the way we mix up the fecal samples, add solution, and then take out a very small amount of that, put it on a little slide with a grid on it, and then count the eggs. When we get done counting, we multiply by 50. So if we find one egg when we're counting, then we multiply by 50 and say it's 50 eggs per gram. So we get, if it's below 50, it's 0, and then it goes up in multiples of 50. So that's why if you're currently doing that and vet calls back and reports to you how many eggs per gram you have, they never say 47 or 133. They always say something that's a multiple of 50. You can do the dilution slightly differently when you're doing the McMaster and get it down to 25 and multiples of 25. But the way I do it, and the way most of us in Ontario do it, it's multiples of 50. If we have less than 200 eggs per gram, that is considered low. And generally our recommendation is going to be not to deworm that horse for small strongyles. If we have other issues going on that makes us worry about large strongyles or makes us worry about roundworms, or we find some roundworms, that may change the story. But strictly speaking, from a small strongyle basis, below 200, we don't care. Between 200 and 500 is considered moderate. And most of the time our answer is going to be go ahead and deworm those horses, because they're shedding enough eggs that they have a burden that is unlikely to cause a problem, but they're shedding a lot of eggs into the environment, and there is potential for issues there. Once we get to 500 eggs per gram, we're going to consider those horses high shedders, and we want to deworm those horses for sure. And just to reiterate, as I said, this is only great at identifying strongyles and not picking the difference between large and small strongyles, and it can pick up roundworms, and hopefully we're reporting roundworms separately for you. So the fecal egg counts can be performed at many vet clinics. Not all offer it, but many of us do right in-house in our labs, or we can send them out to a laboratory like the Animal Health Lab at the University of Guelph to do the fecals. With the right equipment and training, horse owners can learn how to do fecal egg counts on their own. It's something that we often actually teach our sheep producers to do, because they've got a lot more animals to deal with often, and their cost of deworming starts to be 10 or sometimes 100 times what it would be if we have 2 horses to do. So if you're interested in that, that's something to talk with your vet about. Could we do it? If you've got 30 or 40 horses around and you want to do fecal egg counts on them routinely 2 or maybe 3 times a year, it starts to add up to a lot of money to do them individually. I'm going to say cost ranges somewhere in the $20 to $25 neighborhood, up to maybe $50, depending on the lab fees that each vet charges. When we're collecting fecals, please collect them into Ziploc bags is lovely. And we need about 2 to 3 fecal balls. I do not need a shovelful from each horse. It doesn't help us, we throw it away anyway. So a couple balls in a Ziploc bag into the fridge before you bring them to us. And we would like them to be sampled at less than 12 hours living free in the environment, the fecal ball. So nice way to do that is to make sure we have a clean stall when we put horses in at night. Bring me samples in the morning. Or or the other way around. It gets tricky if we have horses that aren't stalled because they all live together. So figuring out whose poo is who. But if you have some stalls, it is fairly common for horses to both pee and poo not very long after we come into a stall, just because that's the way it is. So particularly horses that don't live in a stall, they're like, ooh, clean environment, I should grab all over this. So so that's the best thing to do. If we don't have stalls, even just a couple of gates to make a pen in the corner for a bit so that we know whose poo it is. Because really the question when we're doing fecal egg counts is about each individual horse. Doing kind of random sample of the group might help us a little bit, but isn't going to be great because we probably got a lot of variability there. And that probably is the next slide. So most studies have shown that approximately 20% of adult horses shed approximately 80% of the eggs in the environment. So when we look at any group of horses, there's a bunch that like shedding eggs and there's a bunch that don't. There are a bunch of things that go into that. Most of the reason for shedding a bunch of eggs is immune based. So horses develop immunity to the worms and don't let as many attach in the gut, and then they don't lay as many eggs. And there's some that are just not good at fighting off those worms. It doesn't necessarily mean they're unhealthy otherwise. In some cases it does. If we've got an old horse with Cushing's, they're more likely to be a high shedder. Not necessarily, but more likely to be. If we have a horse that's immune compromised for any reason, I'm going to say most of the time our horses that are on immune modulators for things like COPD or heaves tend not to shed anymore. We don't have them at an immunosuppressive dose that's hurting the whole body, but it could if they were on really high doses. So in stable groups of adult horses, less than 50% of the horses are likely to benefit from a midsummer deworming. There's a couple of studies to show that, some from North America, some from Europe, but if we do those fecal egg counts, oftentimes there might be as many as 80% of a group don't need deworming, but that 50% mark would get you about half of them under 200 eggs per gram. We might get 20 or 30% in that 200 to 400 range where we're like, I don't know whether we really need to or not, but maybe we will anyway to be safe. Generally, high shedding horses remain high shedders year after year. So if we do fecal egg counts in, say, the 15th of July, and we do them 3 years in a row, and old Fred has been 600 eggs per gram, and then he was 800 eggs per gram, and then he was 550 eggs per gram. The next year, we probably may as well just deworm old Fred, because almost for sure he's going to be high again. Little Betsy is if she's been 0, 0, 50, and for those 3 years, probably she's going to be okay again and low, as long as nothing's changed about her life. So as long as she doesn't have something else that she's fighting immunologically, she's become pregnant and had a baby, she's developing Cushing's, all those sorts of things. So it's not to say just stop after 2 or 3 years, but in really stable populations of horses, the groups tend to stay the same who they are, particularly the high shedders. So after a while, we start to give up on the high shedders and just deworm them. Then the question is, what do I use? So we've done a fecal egg count. I've said 500 eggs per gram. I think we should deworm. Well, what do I use, doc, is often the question then. And the short answer is whatever works. And you say, well, that's really big help. Thank you. But I don't really have any way of knowing. And essentially what I'm telling you after that fecal is your horse has small strong giles. So nothing about that process helps us to decide which wormer is going to work on your farm. So fenbendazole is one of our wormer options. That's Panicure or Safeguard. This is an excellent wormer for roundworms and foals. There's very little resistance in roundworms to fenbendazole. If we use it at the high dose, which is 10 milligrams per kilogram for 5 days in a row, we can kill encysted small strongyles with it as long as there is no resistance. So if there is resistance, of course, it's not going to work necessarily at all kill. And if it doesn't kill the ones that aren't hiding in the gut, it's not going to kill the ones that are hiding in the gut for sure. There is documented resistance to Safeguard. This is one of the reasons we were so excited to get Ivermectin products 30-ish years ago or longer, because we were starting to see resistance to, at that time, we were using a lot of liquid fenbendazole, so we were using white liquid wormer. We can still use that, but it comes in a paste too that doesn't fly all over the place quite as easily. And so we're going to compare all of our wormer classes. And so I want you to just kind of remember that fenbendazole takes 4 or 5 weeks for egg reappearance. So this is if we follow the same horses out and monitor their fecal egg counts, we will see eggs again 4 to 5 weeks later. Pyrantel is the next worm we're going to mention, and so that's Strongid or Exodus. Pyrantel is effective against tapeworms at double the dose. It doesn't matter which, if you're using Strongid, it doesn't matter which one you use. One's called Strongid P and one's called Strongid T. T is for tapes, but P is for paste. So T should actually be an L for liquid. So you can double dose paste wormer and have the same effect as using the double dose of the liquid. So Pyrantel is going to be effective for most roundworms and small strong giles. And again, we've got that 4 to 5 weeks for eggs to reappear, which essentially means that both fenbendazole and Pyrantel don't hang around in the body for very long, because it's going to take about 4 weeks for new eggs that are ingested to make it out as, larvae that are ingested to turn into eggs in the manure. So so that's telling us that we've only got like a week of extra effect from those products. Ivermectin is the next one. So that's Acthalin, Bimectin, and a whole bunch of other generics. We definitely have resistance documented in roundworms. Actually, the most famous research on that was done at Gardner Farms in Caledon East. They had been using lots and lots of ivermectin in their foals and yearlings until it quit working. So that's one of the best documented resistance in roundworms. If it works on roundworms, it can actually be dangerous because it kills worms by paralyzing them, and it kills all of the worms that are present essentially at the same time and quickly. It's sort of like a nuclear bomb to roundworms, where fenbendazole is a machete. So the machete is still effective, but it takes longer to kill all of them. So it's a gentler, safer wormer that way for roundworms. So if we take a 1.5-year-old horse that has a whole bunch of roundworms and has never been dewormed in its whole life and give them ivermectin, if they're not resistant, we can have a very sick, colicky horse in 12 hours to 24 hours after we give the dewormer. Our egg reappearance is going to be about 6 to 8 weeks. And there is a combo available with praziquantel that kills tapeworms. So that's Acthalin Gold or Equimax. So those are, if we're going to kill those tapeworms, this is a good option for that. Moxidectin is the next class. So that is Quest. It is effective against encysted small strong giles. In my hands, if we're going to worry about encysted small strong giles, or we have a horse that it is particularly winter time and we're really worried about those encysted strong giles, and we've got a horse that's really ill thrifty, or we're having colicky trouble, and we want to make sure we've got those encysted small strong giles killed. To me, it makes sense to give them 1 dose of Quest as opposed to 5 doses of fenbendazole. It's going to be cheaper, and I only have to touch the horse once to do it. So I like that. I'm not a very big fan of feeding dewormers, so fenbendazole is available in pellet form. I don't particularly like it because I'm less sure that the horse got their dose, particularly if we're in a group situation. People that get most excited about thinking they're going to deworm that way are people that have 20 horses all living in a field together, and they say, well, I can't catch them, I can't, do all of those things. But in those situations, it's quite normal for one horse to eat 3 horses' buckets of feed and the other 2 horses to eat none. And they're probably the ones that need dewormer more than the big dominant tough guy. or tough girl, it most likely is. This Quest has a narrow safety range, so it's important that we use the right dose. Fenbendazole is ridiculously safe. We can practically bathe the horse in it. We could pour a bucket full of it in and give it to a horse, and they're probably going to be okay. Strongyl is quite safe. We use a double dose when we want to kill tapeworms. Ivermectin is reasonably safe, but Quest will get us in trouble if we use a whole tube on a 400-pound pony, for instance. So that would be a triple dose pretty well. And quite often, if we do that, we will quite often see those horses have some funny neurologic sort of troubles. They will stumble, fall down, act really, really weird, and can die. It's not that Quest kills ponies. Ponies are not allergic to Quest or have any issues with it when you use it properly. So I often don't use Quest if I have a whole group of miniature horses or ponies to do, but that's more because I'm worried about making sure you do the dose correctly than it is because it can't be effective. So certainly if I had an issue where I really, really needed to use Quest, I would do it. We would just be careful. We would get our weigh tapes out. We would do something. You know, if we've got minis, we can practically pick them up and hold them on the scale with us to figure out what their dose is and do them well. So cool thing about moxidectin is egg reappearance is about 10 to 12 weeks. So if 12 weeks is 3 months. So that means for sure that if we're using Quest, we don't need to be thinking about going and getting wormer for our horses 3 months after we just gave it, because they've just maybe started to reappear, the eggs. So when we've got a 10 to 12 week window, we want to add 4 weeks to that before we even consider thinking about needing to deworm our horses. So same goes when we talked about ivermectin, we talked 6 to 8 weeks. So again, that gets us to that 12 weeks, no problem. Our shorter acting wormers, we're going to be well there by that 3-month mark. But unless we're in a really, really bad environment, we're not going to probably pick up tons and tons of worms overnight the first day that they start reappearing. Quest is also available with praziquantel as Quest Plus. So when I told you that whatever works is the right answer, how do we figure that out? We use a thing called the fecal egg count reduction test to determine if our wormer is working. So generally we want to do that 2 weeks after our treatment. So for all of those dewormers, that gives us enough time to kill the worms and stop them shedding eggs, and gets us well within that range where we don't expect eggs to reappear yet, if we killed everybody that's home at the time we killed them. So if we do that, when we talk about ivermectin and Quest, we talk about being over 95% of the eggs reduced. So we'd love it for it to be 0. Generally, 0 is the perfect number. But if we have a really high burden before, we allow a very small window of okayness in there. So, and in Strongyl and fenbendazole, we want 90% reduction to say that our wormer's still working okay. Should I rotate, or how should I rotate my dewormer? There is no good research anywhere in the world to tell us what the right thing to do is. There are 2 camps amongst parasitologists, and both of them have a point. One camp says use a wormer that works until it doesn't work anymore and throw it away and use something different then. The upside of that plan is that you do a really good job of developing resistance to one wormer. And if we do things like only deworming the horses that need it, then we leave a bunch of horses shedding small numbers of eggs into the environment that haven't been affected by wormer, haven't been chased around. And because if we deworm all of the horses on our property all at once with the same drug, then essentially all of the eggs that are left to, or all of the worms inside the horse that are left to reinfect pastures are worms that the wormer didn't kill. So leaving some horses untreated, or in some cases even knowing that we didn't kill the encysted small strong giles, so we know we're leaving some of those alone, is a concept called refugia, which means that we're leaving some happy worms in the environment that haven't been attacked by wormer. So there's no pressure, no selection pressure in those worms against the wormer that you're using. So if we're doing that, if we're not deworming everybody, and we're letting some horses essentially keep shedding some worms in pasture. Because if we were going to kill all the small strong giles in the world with the 4 dewormers we'd have done it by now. If we were going to totally eliminate worms from the environment, they would have been all gone in 1988. There would have been no more worms, and the people that sell wormers for a living would be very sad, because they would have had to find something else to do. Even Strongylus vulgaris still exists in the world. We've knocked it way down in importance. But if we quit deworming altogether all horses for a period of 20 years, Strongylus vulgaris would come back as a major issue. It'd probably take 20 years to build up in the environment and happen, but that's never going to happen, so we don't have to worry about it. I like the idea of using ivermectin or moxidectin product once a year possibly on all of our horses. This is kind of our insurance policy, to give everybody a chance to get cleared out, that if our fecal lied to us or if something else happens to the horse. There's some weird things, like we were talking last night about habernemia, which is a funny parasite that crawls in and out of the skin of the neck, things like that. Bots, for example, maybe pinworms that we're not picking up regularly through this worming, and not that really any of those things are lethal to the horse. They're not likely to kill them, but we kind of keep them at bay. Even Strongylus vulgaris, if we use those products once a year, we're probably just don't have to worry about that at all. It's not wrong to say we're going to do a fecal on all of our horses at least twice a year, and those who stay low all the time, we're not going to do. That's actually better. But if we have to remember if something weird is happening to that horse and they haven't had any wormer for 3 years, that we should think about, we haven't covered them for all those diseases that we almost don't think about anymore because they're so rare, because we're so used to lots of wormer. And I've got tapeworms yearly up there with a question mark. If we believe that science that says tapeworms cause increased chances of colic, then once a year is a good idea. More than once a year, I don't think anywhere really suggests that that's necessary. Certainly, and if you see lots of tapeworms after you deworm for tapeworm, don't panic and feel like, oh my God, my horse has lots of tapeworms, I need to do it again in a month or 2 months or something. Be happy. You did something that was worthwhile. And that horse should have very, very few to none for a period of time. So they're probably good for a year. So the very simplest program I use on a lot of farms is that we once a year use something like Equiland Gold or Quest Plus in the fall after a frost, late October, early November, and then we monitor throughout the rest of the year. So a monitoring period, once we kind of start to get to green grass growth, late April, early May, and maybe another monitoring period mid to late July, particularly on the horses that haven't been dewormed. And then what to use depends on what's working on your farm. I never finished the thought of the other camp for how to rotate dewormer. So the other camp is to use a different product every time you deworm, essentially. And the old chart that had you deworming 4 times a year and picking a different wormer every time, the 4 times a year was always stupid. That midwinter, that February deworming never made biologic sense, particularly if we were using something that didn't kill encysted small strong giles at that period of time. But that rotation says, well, we're going to slow down resistance, because if you've got ivermectin resistance, then we're going to hammer you with pyrantel the next time, and that'll kill all the ivermectin resistant ones. And then we'll use fenbendazole. And if there's any pyrantel resistant ones hanging around, we'll bash them with fenbendazole. And that works good as long as that's true. But as soon as we get some that didn't get killed by ivermectin, now didn't get killed by pyrantel, now we have double resistance, potentially. At this point, that's not out. That hasn't really happened, particularly out there. Even the worms that there are, I'm sure there are some worms out there that are fenbendazole and ivermectin resistant. Not great, huge populations of them. And we've done most of this wrong on most horse farms for most of 30 years. And we're not seeing rampant resistance, but it's starting. And we know from other species that if we just carry on blindly like we are, that it will get worse. We have to remember when it comes to resistance as well, that resistant worms live in horses and on pastures. So if you have a very closed group of horses on your farm, the risk of developing resistance is mostly by what you do. And some friend that lives an hour away and is your Facebook friend and tells you that they have ivermectin resistance, if their horse never comes to visit and stays overnight and poops on your farm, you're not going to pick up their resistance. The risk is if you do have lots of horses moving and traveling, and the chances of moving resistance really comes in horses moving homes. The chances of picking up a whole bunch of resistant worms at, say, a show facility are pretty small. They're not zero, but they're pretty small. Often because your horse isn't eating grass that has been pooed on very lately, most likely. There's been poo there sometime probably, but probably not really lately. Probably not 10 days ago. I think that's it. How am I doing for time, Deb?
You're good.
Questions? Rex answered everybody's questions about deworming. Rex!
I believe there's no questions. If you think of questions, I'm hanging around, so you can ask later.